We're going to go now to our political panel, though. We have with us today Labor frontbencher Nick Champion in our Adelaide studio, and here with me in Canberra we have government frontbencher Matthew Canavan. I might start with you, Matthew Canavan, because this is interesting. The food processing zone. This could really help your area in Northern Australia. The dining boom, as David Spears was calling it then. Are you across any of the details of this announcement? We understand it's going to come out in the next couple of days.
Well, look, it is extremely exciting. Tom, 2 years ago, I myself was in China for Australia Week in China. I worked for a beef company, and what David said is absolutely right. It's fantastic to have the free trade agreement, but often it is the behind the border issues that come up for our agricultural producers, particularly on a provincial basis in China. We sometimes forget that there really are many countries in China, not just one basically. There are huge provinces, and having these types of zones, we have free trade areas already and access to those in China, but having something specifically for the agricultural processing sector really could be a game changer for our sector. It's often not those tariffs, it's getting access and facilitating your product through port quickly. If we can get better and quicker, our goods there better and quicker and cheaper, that's going to be a huge boon for Australian agriculture producers. And while we always think of ourselves in the Asian region, we've got to remember that Beijing is actually closer to Berlin than it is to Brisbane. These opportunities are not going to fall into our lap, and that's why it's so important that Andrew Robb and Tony Abbott, now Malcolm Turnbull, have built such a strong relationship with China over the last few years.
Nick Champion, this sounds like a pretty positive development given some of the concerns earlier in the week about dairy exports, for example, to China. Does this make you feel better about the China free trade deal, about which Labor had raised some concerns?
Well, of course, it's traditional to support any Australian Prime Minister when they're on their overseas sojourns, whether it be Whitlam or Hawke or Keating or Fraser or any of the rest of them. They've always strived to have a good relationship with China. I guess what we look for is for Malcolm Turnbull to raise issues that are of concern to South Australia as well, and in particular the steel industry, which is struggling in Whyalla. And as you both pointed out, one of the things we find that often people talk about free trade, but what you find is that many other countries raise non-trade barriers, which of course have a big effect on whether we can get our goods in. Of course, Australia doesn't play those games, but we do need to be a bit cautious about the free trade rhetoric, because sometimes people don't practice what they preach.
Matthew Canavan, your thoughts? I know this is a tricky area for Australia essentially. We've got steel flooding the market at below cost from China, but we give them a lot of the iron ore that makes it. So do you think that the PM is going to speak out much on this particular issue?
Well, I'll leave it to the Prime Minister, Tom, to raise matters in China, but the government is sending Karen Andrews, a fellow frontbencher of mine, to an OECD conference on these issues as we speak. These issues around the glut in the steel market are not some that are just affecting Australia. They are affecting producers in the UK as well. So we need to work with in that international environment to bring a good outcome for us. You're right to say, though, of course, that Chinese steel production is not always a bad thing for us, because it does underpin our huge amount of iron ore exports, and just overnight there's been almost 20% growth in Chinese exports and imports, which is a positive sign for the Australian economy, and that's the one thing we've really got to focus on, is continuing a strong economic growth we've been able to achieve over the past quarter of a century in Australia.
Nick Champion, do you concede it's tricky, because I know people are concerned about jobs in the steel-making industry. I don't know in your state it's a particular concern, but you've got, I think, something in the order of $43 billion worth of iron ore being shipped out to China each year. Is it a case of keeping the industry going that's actually bringing a lot more cash to Australia?
Well, I think it's not a question of either or. We can have, as we have had in the past, a strong iron ore export industry and a strong steel industry, but what we need is a steel industry plan. What we need is a strong commitment from all Australian governments, including state and local government, to use Australian steel and Australian standards for both steel manufacture and for fabrication. We ought to remember we've got a huge steel fabrication industry all around the country, and that is also a threat if you lose the domestic steel making capacity. So I think this is a very important industry for Australia, not just for South Australia or Whyalla, but for the country. and that capacity marks us as a strong, if you like, having a strong industrial base. So I think what we need is political leaders with plans. Obviously Bill Shorten will be out this morning announcing his plans for the steel industry. We've written to the Prime Minister a number of times over 6 months and received really no reply, just piecemeal efforts as they wander in and out of Whyalla once or twice.
Okay, we'll see what Bill Shorten has to say. Matthew Canavan, the price of iron ore is obviously a very important thing for Australia as well. From a low of about $38 last year, it's up to 60. We could be talking, if this holds at the next budget, an extra $7 billion or so each year in terms of revenue. Is it tempting to think that maybe an income tax cut is affordable again now?
Well, Tom, we've got to be very careful that we don't let fall into the trap of relying on world commodity markets to underpin our budget health. We've got a very serious task to make sure we get our budget back into shape after years of wasteful spending from Labor. They've racked up nearly $400 billion in debt over that period. And we've got a big job ahead. We've been opposed from the savings we've wanted to pass. There's still $13 billion in savings stuck in the Senate. The Labor Party are still opposed to $35 billion of savings we could get through. The biggest threat to the Australian economy and the Australian budget is not world commodity prices, it's a newly elected Labor government, because they'll have no discipline over our budget and just let the purse strings go again.
So briefly then, you wouldn't be tempted to look at this as revenue that's locked in and be using it on those income tax cuts, which there was so much talk from Joe Hockey and Scott Morrison about bracket creep that's gone by the wayside.
Well, this is separate from any issue around bracket creep, Tom. This is about our terms of trade and what we get for selling our goods. And we've said in both the budgets this government has delivered that we're not going to let those kinds of sometimes temporary increases in our income go towards extra spending. We will seek to save those if that is our luck to have. And I'm sure that will be our continuing strategy in this budget. We will be developing tax reform plans to last us decades, not through any blips in the commodity markets.
Nick Champion, we saw Bill Shorten rule a line through any sort of company tax cut that Labor will offer. Do you think that he should or he will offer some sort of income tax cut? Can Labor's plans afford that?
Well, I guess that's up to Bill to make those announcements at the appropriate time. But I guess just to comment on Matt's sort of diatribe, this government came to power promising to cut the deficit and they doubled it. They promised to provide economic and governmental stability, and we've seen not just the change of a Prime Minister but the change of a Treasurer and 14 other ministerial changes. So disastrous, chaotic mismanagement by this government, and it's now what they've given Australian retailers is effectively a 3-month election campaign, and every retailer in the country knows that when you have an election campaign, then all the spending sort of starts to dry up. So really, what we've got is a government that's smashed consumer confidence.
Just on the potential for Labor though, Nick Champion, are you pleased that the income tax cut for Labor at least seems to be on the table as an option?
Well, again, that's for Bill and the shadow cabinet. They wouldn't expect me or want me to make announcements on the run. I think it's important to consider, these things in the economic context of the time. I do think, though, we have to be careful about volatile commodity prices and relying on them. We've learnt that they go up in an escalator and down in an elevator, and so that volatility just simply has to be accounted for.
Okay. Yeah, well, I dare say both sides have probably learned that lesson by now. We're going to take a quick break on AM Agenda. Back with more. Stay with us. You're watching AM Agenda, and we're within our political panel now. We have Nationals frontbencher Matthew Canavan here in the studio, and also Labor frontbencher Nick Champion in Adelaide. I might move on, Matthew Canavan, to this Royal Commission that's proposed by Labor into banks and financial services. Quite a few of your Nationals colleagues have expressed either support for this or an openness to it, and certainly concerns about the industry. People in rural and regional electorates in particular, do you understand or share those concerns?
Well, I think it's very important, Tom, to draw a contrast between the genuinely held and long-held views of people like Senator Williams, my colleague from New South Wales, and what Bill Shorten's going on about at the moment. This is clearly a politically charged, a politically opportunistic move by Bill. Labor Party a year ago were opposed to a Royal Commission into the banking sector, despite some of their own senators calling for it. and they've changed their view ahead of the election. Surprise, surprise. And it's just another reason why the Labor Party are one huge risk to our economy. You should not play politics with our banking sector. I know we all sometimes don't like the banks, but we do need them. They are an essential part of our economy.
You mentioned John Williams. He does want a Royal Commission.
Yeah, that's right, and he's held that view for a couple of years now. There was a Senate economics report put down, I think, in around May 2014, and the Labor chair of that committee also, Mark Ferner, I was just searching for his name, also supported for that call for a Royal Commission. Now, Labor Party did nothing then, and surprise, surprise, a few months from the election.
But even if this is about the politics, what about whether it should happen or not? Are you saying John Williams is wrong? He knows this stuff inside out. Do you agree with what he's saying about this?
No, look, I have a different view to John on this, and that's perfectly fine. I don't always agree with John, and what I think we need to be focused on is prosecuting the bad behaviour in the banking sector. Too often, sometimes when these types of things happen, we then try and say, well, the whole sector's bad, let's throw the good out with the bad.
Okay.
What we should be doing is letting ASIC do its job. It's got enough powers, it's got more powers, in fact, than a Royal Commission would have. And it can get on with doing its job and police those that are doing the wrong thing.
Nick Champion, it appears as though Labor has pushed the government a bit on this, and they're talking to ASIC now, the Treasurer Scott Morrison, nothing guaranteed at this stage. But what about putting some more money back on the table for ASIC? Because the government might lead you on this, put back some of the cuts they took out, and suddenly they're promising more in the short term for this regulator that will be able to make a difference straight away rather than a Royal Commission in 2 or 3 years' time.
Well, what we have is the government tying itself in knots over this, and you heard from Mr Canavan just how awkward that leaves the front bench in. I mean, Senator Williams has been calling for this for some time, responsibly calling for it. There have been Senate reports that have called for it, and there's been a mounting weight of evidence that the Royal Commission is necessary. So we're going to have a sensible Royal Commission. It will report to government. It will be able to make recommendations about systemic issues, which ASIC can't do. We're all for making sure that ASIC is well funded, but the government caused this crisis in ASIC funding. They've cut the 120 million. Now, sort of 5 minutes before midnight, before an election, they're sort of scrambling around for a position. They should simply listen to Senator Williams and listen to the Labor Party and have a Royal Commission.
We'll see where this goes. It doesn't appear as though that will happen, but maybe some more money in the budget. If I can move on finally, Matthew Canavan, to the Senate next week. All the focus is going to be on the Red House. I'm sure you'll enjoy the attention. What's going to happen with these union bills? What's your sense of whether they'll be debated truly and whether the government actually wants to pass them or just wants that early election?
Oh, well, look, Tom, we absolutely want to get these things passed. It was something the Coalition took to the last election. It's something we've tried to pass already through the Senate, and our commitment is strong to clean up the corruption in the trade union sector, because we're pushing it again next week. Now, I'll certainly be voting for what the Australian people decided at the last election, was that we did need to clean up that corruption in this sector. It is an important sector to our economy, the construction sector, and we can't afford to have unions doing the wrong thing, constantly pushing up prices and costs and shutting down opportunities for small businesses in that sector. So I'll be voting for it. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know where the crossbenchers will be. I know the Labor Party and the Greens will be lockstep into their paymasters, the CFMEU, but it's now up to the crossbenchers next week about what happens.
Nick Champion, we know where Labor sits on the position of the bills, but surely at least Parliament's back, the Senate's back, that Labor should play ball, debate this, not, as some reports go, perhaps simply move on the agenda, try to adjourn the Senate, whatever it might be. Surely you're at least up for the debate.
Well, we can have the debate, but we've been having the debate all term and for much of the previous term too. But when blue-collar workers look to Canberra, what they see is a government that's getting stuck into construction workers, that's getting stuck into low-paid truck drivers, that's getting stuck into people's penalty rates and getting stuck into people's jobs. And it's little wonder that there's a blue-collar revolt in this country. You can see it in every opinion poll, that they're really having a close look at the Turnbull government and deciding they don't like what they see.
Okay, but when you say we're up for the debate, does that mean you think Labor should not be part of any sort of move to adjourn the Senate, to not debate the bills, to shut down debate, whatever it might be, to join with the Greens and the crossbench to effectively make those 2 weeks in Parliament almost useless?
Well, the Senate will have its, its own tactics and its own method of doing things. I don't pretend to understand it. I'm a House of Reps member. But I guess the point I'd make to you is
you're a
these are
Labor
not
member
new
and they
issues,
can
and
play
they don't
ball
justify
and have the
new
debate,
sittings of
can't they?
Parliament. We've had the ABCC as a matter of public debate for the last 10, 15 years. We've had the Road Safety Tribunal as an issue for the last 3 years, since 2011. So none of these are new issues. None of them justify this sort of urgency and crisis decision making that you see from this government. It's simply politics from the Turnbull government to have this sort of faux debate in the Senate and faux sitting of the Parliament. We're coming back for just 2 days next week. They're going to drag us all to Canberra for just 2 days and then send us home again.
Okay. Matthew Canavan, I know you're keen to say something. 10 seconds.
Well, I can't believe that hypocrisy from Labor. They held us up in the Senate for full 24 hours last time we sat to introduce a bill. They delayed tactics all the time. Now they're complaining about having to sit more.
We all remember that sitting. Maybe it'll happen again. We'll bring our pyjamas and toothbrushes. That's all the time we have for AIM Agenda, though. Matthew Canavan, Nick Champion, thanks for your time today.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
Thanks, mate.